Hello Wanderers, I'm Tink 11000. Today I'm joined by visionary artist Stephan Martinière. We'll be talking about his career, his artistic inspirations, clean NFTs, and his work for Verses. Hello Stephan, thanks for joining me today.
That's a pleasure to be here, thank you.
Your art is featured in the Verses trading card game. Can you tell me about the pieces you made and when they will be available?
Yeah, the available works that are upcoming, several images. One today, actually, which is called the Prodigal Son, which is actually based on a book cover that was called the Redemption Falls, which was done, well, I would say a few years ago, part of a whole series, very fantasy-like. It's very, very interesting. So that's one of them for today. On March 1st, there's another image coming up called the Grand Emergence, which was actually based on another book series of a quartet, and this one was called The Price of Spring. Very intricate, economical fantasy story takes place in some kind of a very, very well imagined world with sorceries, magic, economic machinery. I mean, it was very intriguing, very, very cool. Each cover had its own flavor based on a different season, and this one being used was the spring, green and yellows in terms of palettes and tones, which was really, really cool. And the last one, I think in March 15, is going to be Ashes, which is actually based on another book cover called The Ashes of Candace, which was, again, another book series. This one very different, with kind of a world I described being floating cities in space, in the sky, imagining the skies as being the sea. And so the navigation is based on that premise that the sky is the sea, and that links different city that floats in the air, which was very, very creative. And so pirate stories, adventures, swashbuckling, it's all the good stuff that makes a good fantasy story happen.
We've actually changed our release schedule, so Ashes and the Grand Emergence won't be released until after October. But I must say, I love the use of color and light in Ashes.
Yeah, it's very bright. I always love to do that. I mean, one of the things I love the most when I do a cover is the use of mood and light. To me, I think that's what the most important. I mean, it always carries much more narrative into an image. Again, it draws you in much, much stronger by having these depth of colors and tones.
You create these layered, beautiful compositional masterpieces, and I'm curious about what else inspires you in your creative process when you're creating them.
I mean, it's interesting. It's an interesting question. Many things, in fact. The first thing, obviously, is the offer and the book, because if it's a commission to create a book cover, there's already a story behind it. So publishers always approach me, I'm assuming because of my sensibility and what I can bring to an image to tell a story, to tell that particular story of a book. Authors also know me and request me because they know, based on what they're trying to imagine, I would be able to create a very interesting, representation of their world by bringing a flavor and something that maybe not necessarily that they had thought about. Actually, I've been in several scenarios where what I brought into a painting kind of changed some of the writings of a book because of what was depicted in that cover, which excited the authors. We decided to change a chapter or change, a few things to make it work with the image. So it's a very interesting dynamic when you can participate as an artist into trying to make yourself available to a narrative that already exists, but create maybe an alternate narrative, or at least an additional narrative that could enhance, the actual story. So to me, that's the exciting part of it, is to be part of understanding a story, dive into that story, and then try to extract my own visual on what I'm reading when I'm reading these excerpts, or chapters, and try to envision, how as an artist I would depict that the same way I would approach that when I do film. When I work on a film and there's only a script, the visual is up for grab. So it's a relationship between directors, production designers, and artists to define a visual that would make the essence of the film.
It's really powerful to have that collaborative interplay between authors, artists, and directors. Which leads to my next question. Why are you excited to be a part of the Verses TCG and have your art turned into a playable game?
I'm excited about that Versus game because it is exactly doing the same thing at a different level. It is a narrative game. It is allowing each player to create their own stories based on different scenarios and permutations that are available based on the board, on the game board. So in a sense, you're using the image which already had a story in itself, but that story is becoming an open book that could become a launch platform for something else, because there's so much information in the image itself that I'm hoping it will allow a player to decide different path of exploration in one way or another based on the intent and the goal of each player, having an image that has potentially that power. And then on top of that, creating a combination between many more images, whether it's your own or the other players, to also shift the narrative and see where it goes. And to me, that's fascinating. I mean, it's a very, again, in some ways, very intellectual process. It's like reading a book and discovering a story and imagining that story at the same time as you're reading it in your own way.
You see this happening in the Verses Discord. The narrative writers take the image and write a story about it, then the Discord votes on what happens next in the story, and then this impacts how the game is designed.
It's almost like, I remember when I was a kid and I always loved drawings and I always wanted to tell a story in drawings. So you have a piece of paper and you create a world. In some ways, you're doing the same. The image is here, but it's an image that allows you to still explore and imagine other things, and then now combine that image with other images to create a bigger world and a different narrative. So it's like you're giving something at the disposal of the players to play with, which is cool.
Now you've got me wondering about the worlds you created as a child.
Oh, well, it was always based on what I was reading. And honestly, I was bombarded with so many different magazines, comic books all over the place, because at the time, really, France was at the golden age of the comic book. So there was so much I was getting from so many different artists and sources. So everything I was drawing was just trying to emulate, what I love, so I like this particular comic book. I like this particular artist or this particular character. And that's what I was drawing and then putting out my own stories, so, and it was always very different. There was no limit of imagination because there was so much creative wealth available around me, which was great.
I'd love to see some of those images someday.
I still have some. Maybe at some point, maybe we should post some.
That would be fun.
A sense about what it used to be and what I became with all that. It's always interesting because I always look at it this way too. When I go through my files and I find a drawing that I was doing 20, 30, 30, 40 years ago, and always amazed, to see what actually was interesting in it or not. And it's always good memories to look at that.
Going that far back and revisiting your old work sounds like it'd be interesting.
Yeah, I know a few artists who did that, and it's very interesting. You take old world, you see what was done at the time, you reevaluate based on where you are, and you create something fresh, but it's based on something you've done. And there's always surprises. And obviously it always gets better, but it's nice to see the evolution, So it's very cool when an artist do that.
When you think about the story behind the picture, but also the story behind the artist's relationship with that picture, then you factor in the art and Verses narrative, and then the Discord helping to create a new story. There are just so many different layers of storytelling.
Yeah. It's interesting because in some ways it reminds me a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, where at the very beginning of it, when you had a storyteller that was driving the narrative of a game with players around that needed to shape their story based on what they imagined they wanted to be as a character. So there was less visual at the time. It was all about writing and throwing dice because you need some kind of a path of direction, but shaping it based on the decision that you make. And it's in some ways very similar, but now you have a whole visual at your disposal that allows you to even being more creative based on what you're looking at.
That's almost exactly what some of the Verses artists have told us. Pat Morrissey Lewis is in our Discord and she votes on the narrative stories. And she said it really reminded her of Dungeons and Dragons.
It's all about your imagination, and it's how you shape your own destiny. And the fact that it's not necessarily a competitive game for fight, but the goals are much broader and much more interesting. If you want them to be so, then you can explore, very interesting narrative in that process. You could dictate a story that would be very, very rich.
What's a narrative or story from a work of yours that you'd like to see explored more by other people?
It's interesting. It's a hard one to answer because I've done so many different images with so many different narratives in them. But it was always works done in collaboration with other people. So I don't think I have ever. I take that back. I think what I'd like to explore is something that actually no one has seen yet. Is stories that I have in my head that I would like to illustrate to create bigger stories, whether it's for an animation project or a film project. I've been involved in different ideas to create my own stories, as opposed to be at the disposal of a team to participate with, a bigger project. I have ideas about my own stuff, and sometimes they're very simple stories. I have kids stories. For kids' books, and I have also very complex stories that could be turned into films and an animation project. But it's all in my head. It's all in my head. I'm still always very busy, so finding the time to kind of put all that aside and do something personal is always a challenge.
I'd love to hear those stories someday.
It's going to be a time I'm going to have to slow down and then say, okay, well, let's do something different. Right now, I'm more focused on doing art that is more personal, not necessarily tied to a story or a narrative or a game or a film, but more like a different type of art, exploring something that means something else to me, as opposed to be commission work, or work that I've done for, 35 years. I'm trying to kind of re-explore and reimagine something different because I've always been attracted to other types of arts, abstract, different type of artists, and so I'd like to explore that a bit in the next few years and see where it goes.
What kind of exploring have you been doing lately? The
excitement, and it took me a few years to really get into understanding, what I was doing, why I was doing it. I always thought it needed to be something drastically different that had nothing to do and no connection to what I've done for 35 years. And I realized that I was completely the wrong way of thinking. And what I'm finding out right now is trying to develop something that is more personal, using what I've learned and what I know, and transmute that into something different. So instead of putting aside all the experience I have in 3D, all the experience I have in narrative, storyboarding, and all the different things I've done in that industry for so long, is combining all that to create different type of artwork. Whether it's very abstract, whether it's very graphic, I'm still exploring different ideas, but I'm not pushing away what I've learned. I'm trying to embrace it. So I have some exploration right now that I'm doing purely in 3D, in very abstract forms, purely artistic for no particular reason, just for the exploration itself, to see what comes out, purely from a design standpoint. But I'm embracing the 3D instead of saying I've done 3D all my life. I shouldn't be doing that if I want to do something different. So I'm saying I'm using that. And in that process, I'm even learning more 3D, which is great because now I'm still learning in that process, but I'm also creating something different using the same tools. And I'm doing the same thing with 2D. All the experience I had with digital and Photoshop, I'm not trying to reapply to create other piece of artwork that are not necessarily obvious. They're abstract, they're graphic, they're purely personal, and where they go, I don't know. We'll see. It'll happen, I think, when it happens.
That sounds fulfilling. Creating solely for the joy and exploration for yourself.
Yeah. I just hope that I have more time for that. And I will make that time eventually, but that's where it's going to go. I don't think I'd ever stop doing what I do in terms of being available for that industry, because I am who I am, and I have a skill set that is very relevant. So as long as I can use it and the projects are fun to do, I will. Because it makes sense to me. That's who I am. But there's the other part that wants to explore and constantly learn something different. And whether it's a sculpture, 3D, 2D, that keeps me going. So it's looking up to the future, and other things that could be happening too.
You've had a long and successful career making art. As an artist, what do you think of NFTs? Did the fact that Verses uses NFTs influence whether or not you got involved with this project?
Well, it is an interesting animal, that's for sure. I didn't know much about NFT recently, and it kind of exploded, out of nowhere, about 6 months ago, something like this. And then I started receiving phone calls from people talking to me about getting involved in NFT project, and says, I'm not quite sure what that is. And when I was reading what it was, I just couldn't understand it. I says, what is really the meaning of it? Why? And then the more I was understanding the principle of it, the more I tried to understand, what it is, and in some ways it makes sense. In some ways, I'm looking at it right now, it's a new type of collector market. But what's very interesting, even that to me was very strange too, because as a collector, I can understand buying a physical object that I'm putting on my wall, on my shelf, that makes sense. I can understand the connection. Buying something that's purely digital was very difficult for me to kind of grasp. But now that the NFT is bridging into the game world, and so you can create an ecosystem by buying something that you could own and is a collectible, but is also part of a bigger picture of a game, whether that game is Verse or any other type of games out there are being created. I think that makes much more sense to me, because now, there's more meaning to what you're buying, And so I think it's very interesting. But there was the whole aspect about the footprint of these NFT, which was very controversial at the very beginning, which was actually, got me to think twice about wanting to get involved with something that is so, in some ways, destructive, in terms of what it needs. But Verse and the Tezos and what it's using, which is why, I was so interested in doing it with you guys. It's a very, very low footprint. That's the kind of NFT that is making sense, which I believe and I hope, the entire industry is going to move into, to kind of really, put an end to the controversy of NFTs that are really not clean, so using a clean technology to create something that, that makes sense, creating a new market, I think I'm for it.
It feels like we're pioneers or space explorers just on the verge of this brand new technology and this whole new world that's opening up. The environmental concerns around blockchain is something we take seriously, which is why we're using an energy-efficient proof-of-stake blockchain. We encourage others to think about the environmental impact and show them that it's possible to do things in a sustainable way.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I totally agree. And as a new technology, it's like it has to improve if it wants to survive. And the market has to evolve. Interestingly, it reminds me a lot about what happened to the gallery world and printing, where I remember very, very clearly a time where the idea of print was a big no-no in the gallery world, because print meant copies, meant less value. And so a piece of art was only valuable if it was done traditionally as an oil and acrylic on a canvas. The classic way. And the moment they started to talk about printing, people were starting to be cautious and not being very interested. But the industry changed, the economy changed as well, and what happened actually was a financial situation when the whole industry got hit, and it became less obvious for people to buy because maybe less money at their disposal. Then the idea of selling prints started to make a lot more sense because it's cheaper, and you might be selling more, but if you do it right, it's still a better market than not selling anything at all. And it's interesting how the gallery world kind of used the technology in such a way to make it sexy, where there was not really anything sexy about it, to entice buyers to a technology that they might just shy away from because of simply being a print. So the idea of not calling a print a giclée, for example, I think was brilliant, because a giclée is just a French word that means squirt, which is exactly inkjet. But in a gallery, you're not going to say, "Hey, I'm selling you an inkjet print," because the whole market is selling French ink. So how do you make that sexy to a buyer by saying, "Are you buying the same thing, but it's special?" So the whole term giclée kind of came out. Then at the time, because there was not as many printer out there, the Iris print machine was the ruling, the ruling machine there. So printing a giclée on an Iris printer was really something important. But today, now the market is really flooded, with that, and there's no mystery anymore. And yes, everybody calls it a giclée, left and right, and it's a term that is being really easily used. So now the market is doing it in a very different way. They're doing it smarter. So they're creating limited editions or editions that are enhanced. And I do that myself too. As an artist, actually allowed me to reach a market that didn't exist for me, because as a digital artist, I could never produce an oil painting. So all I could sell was print. But with the merging of wanting to sell prints to a higher end market and creating a system of very limited offerings with enhanced attached to that, or very specific things that could be added to the print that makes it more unique, created a sub-market that actually made a lot of artists like me, being digital, very happy, because now we had something more that we could offer to an audience as opposed to just nothing. So all that is the technology changing, allowing a whole new market to explode, and a whole new ways of revenues for people who were struggling before to make a living. So NFT to me is no different in some ways. It's a whole new market that is going to allow a whole lot of people to be able to explore possibilities and sell their art in a way that they could not before. And it's going to be a very smart way to do it, and very, very beautiful way to do it. And then, of course, there's going to be others. But that's the nature of, any new technology. You have to find the good way, to make it work. And once it's there, then you wait for the next new technology.
What an interesting perspective. Your long career as an artist gives you powerful insight into how this new technology can create an emerging market, and artists can benefit from that.
Yeah, it is. It's new, and it's, the possibilities are really, really endless at that point. So, I'm very looking forward to see the futures of the next, 2 and 5 years, and how it's going to shift, and what it's going to become.
Is there anything else you'd like to say about your participation in Verses or other projects, or anything else you'd like to share with us? Well,
yeah, there's a lot of things I could talk about, but the first thing I would say is I'm very excited about Verse, and I really hope that game to be very successful. I hope, players and buyers can embrace it and discover, a whole new way to enjoy, that technology, as well as, the game. So I'm very excited, and I'm looking forward to see it happen, because I know, things takes time to make, but, the potential is definitely super exciting. And at the same time, I'm as excited because I'm also involved in other projects as well. Some of them NFT games, very different. And that is the same question mark, other possibilities, other games out there, different ways of, reaching an audience and engage them in different types of games. And I come from a gaming world, so to me, it's like an extension on how now you play games with a new technology that allows you to do things you could not do before, and then create an economy system with it that would allow players now to kind of play at a different level, and engage at a different level. That is the excitement. So I'm very looking forward to all that. So I think the next, I would say 2-3 years are going to be very interesting coming in.
Thank you, Stephan, for sharing with us your experience, perspective, and of course your wonderful art. If you haven't already, go look at some of Stephan's Verses art, which you can find at mentorpop.com/verses.